Journal live at 7 Eastern Friday morning. Join the discussion.
Former Secretaries of State Henry Kissinger and George Shultz talked about the national security and global challenges facing the U.S. They were joined by former Deputy Secretary of State Richard Armitage, who served under President George W. Bush. They testified before the Senate Armed Services Committee, which is chaired by Senator John McCain, but he was not at the hearing as he remains in Arizona battling brain cancer.
Meeting will come to order. The Senate Armed Services Committee meets this morning to receive testimony on global challenges in the United States national security strategies to meet those threats. It's my honor to welcome our distinguished witnesses, former Secretaries of State Henry Kissinger and George Shultz, and the former Deputy Secretary of State Richard Armitage. Your careers of service have been just unbelievable, been great. We're so honored to have you folks here. I want to begin by reading a brief welcome from our chairman, McCain, who regrets that he's unable to be here for today's hearing. And I'm quoting him now. He says, with the rising global challenges of an increasingly complex and competitive strategic environment, America needs the leadership, wisdom, and experience that only statesmen of this stature can provide. This committee and this nation thank you for your service, and we're grateful for your continued voices of reason during these troubling times. We look to you for the lessons of history as we all seek to secure a safer, freer, and more prosperous world. I guess one of the most enjoyable committee hearings that I've experienced before was 3 years ago when we had a hearing of the same. Both Secretaries, Kissinger and Shultz, were here. And a lot of the comments that you made were very prophetic. Here it is 3 years later. A lot of these things have happened, so we're looking forward to this. Speaking on behalf of the entire committee, we all look forward to having the chairman back soon, and I'm sure he will be. Now more than ever, the challenges of today's world require strategic vision. Each of you is uniquely qualified to help with this committee think through not only our present challenges, but also the strategy needed to meet them. The insights and wisdom you offered then were discerning and have borne out in the years since. The Trump administration recently released a new national security strategy and a national defense strategy, which emphasizes the priority of near-peer competition, the danger of rogue nations, and the enduring threat of terrorism. The national defense strategy is a frank and realistic view of the global strategic environment. It offers a blueprint for protecting our national interests and reestablishing America's position as the undisputed leader of the free world. And it shows a commitment to restoring our military advantage across all domains and strengthening and expanding key alliances. So we just ask each of you to help us think through this strategy. The members of this committee are well aware that the key and success of any strategy requires resources. We need to cast aside partisan politics and pass an appropriation bill while finding a way to fix the defense spending caps that have disseminated our military in terms of readiness and modernization. So we thank you for your service and look forward to your testimony. Senator Reid.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I would like to welcome Dr. Kissinger and Secretary Shultz and Secretary Armitage. This is certainly a distinguished panel, and we are grateful that you're here today. Each of you have played a very important role in some of the most monumental foreign policy decisions in our nation's history. And on behalf of all the members of the committee, we look forward to your testimony. This morning's hearing on global challenges in U.S. national security follows the release last week of the new National Defense Strategy. This strategy, which supports the President's recently released National Security Strategy, states that the central challenge facing our nation is the reemergence of long-term strategic competition with Russia and China, and that this competition replaces terrorism as the primary concern in the U.S. national security. Without question, Russia remains determined to reassert its influence around the world, most recently by using malign influence and active measures activities to undermine the American people's faith in our election process as well as other Western elections. Likewise, China continues to threaten the rules-based order in the Asia-Pacific region by economic coercion of its smaller, more vulnerable neighbors and by undermining the freedom of navigation. Given the experience of our panel, I would welcome their assessment of the strategic threat posed by both Russia and China and what recommendations they have for how the United States can counter these powers both militarily and by utilizing other critical elements of national power. Great power competition may be the current geostrategic reality, but we must not neglect other equally complicated challenges. North Korea's nuclear and ballistic missile efforts are an immediate and grave national security threat. Likewise, Iran continues their aggressive weapons development activities, including ballistic missile development efforts, while pursuing other destabilizing activities in the region. Finally, the United States must remain focused on countering the security threat from ISIS in Iraq and Syria and its spread beyond the Middle East region, while also building the capabilities of the Afghan National Security Forces and deny any safe haven for extremists. In the coming weeks, this committee will hear directly from Secretary Mattis and senior leaders in the Defense Department on how the National Defense Strategy will address the threats facing our nation. As we begin our review of the National Defense Committee, it would benefit this committee to get our witnesses' state assessment of the new strategy and whether it strikes the appropriate balance between great power competition and the ongoing threats posed by rogue regimes, terrorist organizations, and other non-state actors and criminal organizations. Finally, the new strategy emphasizes a simple but key fact: the importance of allies and partners. The esteemed panel before us knows better than most that robust international alliances are essential to keeping our country safe. The National Defense Strategy unveiled last week puts a premium on bolstering current alliances while pursuing new partners. As I have stated many times, I'm deeply concerned about statements from the President that have undercut America's leadership position in the world, alienated our longtime allies, and dismissed the global order the United States helped establish following World War II. These actions isolate the United States and weaken our influence in the world, ultimately leading to uncertainty and the risk of miscalculation. At the same time, the administration has proposed dramatic cuts to the State Department, and career Foreign Service officers are leaving the government at an alarming rate. I am concerned we may seek to counter the whole-of-nation strategies pursued by Russia and China simply by reinvesting in our own comparative military advantage at the expense of necessary investments in diplomacy and development as essential tools of national power. Given our panel's extensive experience cultivating allies and promoting diplomacy, I would welcome their assessment of our current alliances, what more can be done to sustain these critical relationships, and the importance of non-military elements of national power to our security. Once again, I want to thank the witnesses for being here, and more importantly, for their lifetime of service and dedication to the United States of America. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Reid. Normally, we ask our witnesses to confine their remarks to a certain time. I would not be so presumptuous. Talk as long as you want to. Dr. Kissinger, you're recognized. Thank you so much for being here.
And it's a great honor to have this opportunity. And I would like to say one word about our chairman, who I have known for 50 years since he returned from Vietnam. At that time, I had been in Hanoi, and they had offered to let me take him on my plane back to the United States. And I refused on the ground that nobody should get special treatment. And when I met him here at the White House, he came up to me and said, "Thank you for saving my honor." And Senator McCain has preserved and the honor of our country as a great warrior, but also as someone who, wherever the weak were threatened and the just were persecuted, he made it clear that America was on their side and that he was not simply a warrior, but a defender of our values all over the world. So thank you particularly for this occasion. You have asked me to review the international situation, and I've taken the liberty of submitting a statement to the committee. And I will use my time here just to make a few general points and then reply to your questions. I'd also like to say how meaningful it is to me to sit next to my friend and mentor, George Shultz, from whom I've learned so much, and Mr. Armitage, who has performed such great national services. I will deal with your query in three parts. The urgent, exemplified by the North Korean nuclear challenge. The immediate, exemplified by the Middle East, especially Iran. And the long term, to which the chairman referred, exemplified by great power relationships and by the re-entry of great power politics as the key element of international affairs. The international situation facing the United States is unprecedented. What is occurring is more than a coincidence of individual crises. Rather, it is a systemic failure of world order, which is gathering momentum and which has led to an erosion of the international system rather than its consolidation, a rejection of territorial acquisition by force, expansion of mutual trade benefits without coercion, which are the hallmark of the existing system, are all under some kind of strain. Compounding this dynamism, it's the pace of technological development whose extraordinary progress threatens to outstrip our strategic and moral imagination and makes the strategic equation tenuous unless major efforts are made to sustain it. The most immediate challenge to international security is posed by the evolution of the North Korean nuclear program. Paradoxically, it is only after Pyongyang has achieved nuclear and intercontinental breakthroughs accompanied by threatening assertions that measures to deal with it have begun to be applied. That has raised the possibility that, as in the case of Iran, an international effort intended to prevent a radical regime from developing a nuclear capability will culminate at the very point that that regime is perfecting its capacity. For the second time in a decade, an outcome that was widely considered unacceptable is now on the verge of becoming irreversible. My fundamental concern about the nuclear program of Korea is not the threat it poses to the territorial United States, significant as it is. My most immediate concern is the following. If North Korea still possesses a military nuclear capability in some finite time, the impact on the proliferation of nuclear weapons might be fundamental. Because if North Korea could maintain its capability in the face of opposition by China and the United States and the disapproval of the rest of the men of the world, other countries are bound to feel that this is the way for achieving the international prominence and the upper hand in international dispute. So therefore, I think the denuclearization of North Korea must be a fundamental objective. And if it is not reached, we have to prepare ourselves for the proliferation of weapons to other countries, which will create a new pattern of international politics, which will affect our concepts of deterrence and our possibility of deterrence, and which will have to be carefully examined, and which this committee will want to address. In the Middle East, we face the disintegration of the international system as it has existed at the end of the First World War and at the end of the Second World War. And every country in the region is either a combatant or a theater of conflict. And to me, the overriding concerns at the moment are these. We have successfully defeated ISIS, but the question now is the succession. What happens next? And I'm concerned that in the territory once occupied by ISIS, Iranian and Russian forces will become dominant, and that we will see a belt emerging that goes from Tehran to Beirut and therefore undermines the structure of the middle of the region and creates a long-term challenge. And finally, I want to refer to what has been identified by the administration as the dominant element now, the relationship, the great power relationship between the United States and China and Russia. There is no doubt that the military capacity of China, as well as the economic capacity, is growing. And there have been challenges from Russia which have to be met, especially in Ukraine, Crimea, and Syria. And this raises these fundamental questions. What is the strategic relationship between these countries vis-à-vis the prospect of peace? Is their strength comparable enough to induce restraint? Are their values compatible enough to encourage an agreed legitimacy? These are the challenges that we face. The balance of power must be maintained, but it is also necessary to attempt a strategic dialogue that prevents the balance of power from having to be tested. This is the key issue in our relationship. Let me conclude by stressing that I think that the fundamental situation of the United States is strong, that we have the capacity to meet these challenges. China has to deal with significant domestic adjustments, and it's possible that it will balance those against the pressures that it can exert outside. Russia is domestically also in considerable difficulty. And my basic point is that we can maintain a favorable balance of power, but we must couple it with a political structure in which the issue of war and peace has a diplomatic as well as a military expression, because the evolution of the weapons is so great and the challenges to technology are multiplying, that both elements of our national strategy must be stretched. And I'm confident that we can achieve these objectives in that spirit. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kissinger. We pause for a moment here. We have a quorum, and so I ask the committee to consider a list of 1,056 pending military nominations. All of these nominations have been before the committee and require the required length of time. Is there a motion to favorably report this list of 1,056 pending military nominations to the Senate? There's a motion. Is there a second?
Second.
All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. The ayes have it. Secretary Shultz, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I'd like to pay tribute to Senator McCain. Like Henry, I have known him a great long time. He fought for his country in combat. He endured terrible suffering and privation as a prisoner of war, and he managed to handle himself with dignity and pride. Then he has served here as senator and presidential candidate. I remember those days and the slogan, "Country First." That was John McCain, is John McCain, country first, always. So, Senator, I'm sorry you're not here, but I want you to know how much I admire how you have served our country. I'd like to express my appreciation to be testifying alongside my two friends here, Henry Kissinger and Rich Armitage. And I take the occasion to particularly underline one of the things that Henry brought out in his testimony. That is the concern we must have about nuclear proliferation. As you remember, in the Reagan period, we worked hard. President Reagan thought nuclear weapons were immoral. And we worked hard to get them reduced, and we had quite a lot of success. And in those days, people seemed to have an appreciation of what would be the result of a nuclear weapon ever used. I fear people have lost that sense of dread. And now we see everything going in the other direction, nuclear proliferation. The more countries have nuclear weapons, the more likely it is one's going to go off somewhere. And the more fissile material is lying around. Anybody who gets fissile material can make a weapon fairly easily. So this is a major problem. It can blow up the world. So I think we have to get at it. And the right way to start is what Henry said, is somehow to be able to have a different kind of relationship with Russia. After all, Russia and the United States have the bulk of all the weapons. And then start something. I'll have some comments to make about Russia in a minute. I distributed two things. Number one is a little demographic outline, and I want to speak about that. And I also distributed a pre-publication book, and I'm going to talk particularly about two of the articles in the book. One is by T.J. Hammes, a retired Marine Corps colonel. He's at the National Defense University, and others by Lucy Shapiro and her husband. Lucy's a biologist. Her husband is a physicist at Stanford. Lucy is the smartest person in any room she's in, and she's also fun. So sometime if you were looking for something really good, you'd get Lucy to come and testify, and you'd have a ball, but you'd also learn something. But anyway, I'm going to draw on these two papers, so you have that book. But I think my main point is that there are four major forces acting in the world that are going to disrupt it greatly and rapidly. And anything we do has to be aware of these disruptions. The first is demography. And this little chart is one of the things that just shows you briefly what's happening. You can see the blue lines are 2015 to 35, and then 35 on out are the golden lines. And you can see how things are shrinking rapidly. Birth rates are falling. Longevity is rising. In a sense, we used to think of populations as being a lot of young people and a few older people. Now it's totally reversed with huge implications. I think it's worth also noting the big declines coming in the population of China and Russia. I might say on Russia, Russia's economy is not as big as Italy's, and it has twice the number of people. It shows you how poorly they're running their economy. And their population is shrinking. And I think, in a sense, we have Russia playing a weak hand aggressively. And we need what I think of as a Pershing moment to put a stop sign on that and then get on to talking. So I think the first thing to notice is the world population is changing. It's getting older for the most part. The places in the world that are seeing big increases in population are mostly in Africa and some parts of Asia. And these are places where there's big explosions of populations. These are also places where the economies are not good and where probably adverse conditions are most likely to arise. So I think it's almost certain that there's going to be a big effort for people to migrate away from those places. and how the world is going to handle this large migration, you've got to start thinking about it. You can't ignore it. So that's point one. Point two has to do with governance. We are surrounded by information and communications. Information is everywhere. Some of it's right, some of it's wrong. Some of it's put out for a purpose, some of it's just neutral. It's hard to sort it out. And diversity is everywhere. People can look at this information, they can communicate, they can organize, and they do. So we get a lot of government by protest of one kind or another. So we have to learn all over again how to govern over diversity. And just as government is having a hard time, things like nuclear proliferation come along that can only be dealt with by intergovernmental cooperation. So this crisis in government, I think, is a very important thing to address and try to think through. The third and fourth big changes have to do with technology. The first is artificial intelligence, and the second is what's called 3D printing. It really should be called additive manufacturing, but it is a big deal, really coming hard. So I'm going to focus on what is happening with this. First, let me talk about the economy. What is happening as a result of these forces is deglobalization. This is already happening. This is not something for the future. The reason is that it's becoming more and more possible to produce the things you want close to where you are. So the advantages of low labor costs are disappearing. And the more you produce things near where you are, the less you need shipping, and it has a big impact on energy. It has a huge impact on the countries that are providing low-cost labor, and a huge impact on places like ourselves, which will wind up being able to produce these things near where we are. It's a revolution, and a revolution in the economy has all sorts of security implications that need to be thought about. But this is a very big deal. Here's just a sample in terms of information. Over $700 billion in capital left developing economies, greatly exceeding the $145 billion net outflows during the Great Recession. In contrast, foreign direct investment into the United States is growing rapidly. In 2016, FDI flows into the United States reached $391 billion, more than double the $171 billion inflow in 2014. Outflows in 2016 were only $299 billion. Thus, in 2016, the United States saw a net inflow of investment capital of $192 billion. In 2015, the latest statistics available from the Department of Commerce, nearly 70% of the FDI was invested in the manufacturing sector. This is just by way of putting an underline on the point that I was making. Robotics, 3D printing, and artificial intelligence are driving manufacturers to reconsider not only how and what they make, but where they make it. The world is on the very front end of a big shift from labor to automation. Robot sales are expected to reach 400,000 annually in 2018. This estimate does not account for the newly developed cobots, that is, collaborative robots. They assist human workers and thus dramatically increase human productivity. There are other things about all this that I won't go into, which underline it. But the new technologies are bringing manufacturing back to the United States. The United States has lost manufacturing jobs every year from 1998 to 2009, a total of 8 million jobs. For the last 6 years, it regained about 1 million of them. With the cost of labor no longer a significant advantage, it makes little sense to manufacture components in Southeast Asia, assemble them in China, and then ship them to the rest of the world. when the same item can either be manufactured by robots or printed where it will be used. So this is a huge revolution taking place. It also underlines the enhanced ability to protect your intellectual property because you don't have to ship it around. So that's the economic side. Now, the fourth industrial revolution, I'm reading now from Hamas's text, will drive massive changes in the economic, political, and social spheres and will inevitably change warfare too. So you want to look at the dramatic improvements in nanoenergetics, artificial intelligence, drones, and 3D printing. They're producing a revolution of small, smart, and cheap weapons that will redefine the battlefield. Open source literature says nano aluminum created ultra-high burn rates, which give nano explosives 4 to 10 times the power of TNT. The obvious result, small platforms will carry very destructive power. Then you can put these small platforms on drones. And drones can be manufactured easily, and you can have a great many of them inexpensively. So then you can have a swarm armed with lethal equipment. Any fixed target is a real target. So an airfield where our Air Force stores planes is a very vulnerable target. A ship at anchor is a vulnerable target. So you've got to think about that in terms of how you deploy. And in terms of the drones, while such a system cannot be jammed, it would only serve to get a drone, talking about getting a drone to the area where its target is, but not to ensure it could hit a specific target. At that point, the optical systems guided by artificial intelligence could use onboard multispectral imaging to find a target and guide the weapons. Exactly that autonomy that makes the technological convergence a threat today. Because such drones will require no external input other than the signature of the designed target, they will be not vulnerable to jamming. Not requiring human intervention, the autonomous platforms will also be able to operate in very large numbers. So that's a revolution in the way warfare will be conducted. You have all sorts of ways of enhancing the impact of the weapon by explosively formed penetrators and by what they call bringing the detonator, that is, learning how to hit something that has a lot of explosives in it and blowing them up. Now, the Chinese are very much onto this. The Chinese can transport, erect, and fire these fairly large drones, 9-foot wingspan, with a 2-person crew. A similar-sized truck can be configured to carry hundreds of U.S. Switchblade or Israeli Hero-sized drones. Thus, a single battery of 10 trucks could launch thousands of autonomous active hunters over a battlefield. So the Chinese know how they can. We have bases in Japan, airfields, they can take them out. You've got to learn how to disperse and change the way you deploy. So this makes domain denial much easier than domain usage. I think there's a great lesson here for what we do in NATO to contain Russia, because you can deploy these things in boxes so you don't even know what they are, and on trucks, and train people to unload quickly and fire. So it's a huge deterrent capability that is available, and it's inexpensive enough so that we can expect our allies to pitch in and get them for themselves. I might say on cyber, there was some mention of that earlier. There is a big problem, but it's important to remind her that all networks have nodes in the real world. Some of them are quite exposed. And so we combine that fact with the possibility of autonomous drones and maybe you can do something about those nodes. The creative use of swarms of autonomous drones to augment current forces could strongly and relatively cheaply reinforce NATO, as I said, deterrence. If NATO assists frontline states in fielding large numbers of inexpensive autonomous drones that are prepackaged in standard 20-foot containers, the weapons can be stored in sites across the countries under the control of reserve forces. If the weapons are prepackaged and stored, the national forces can quickly deploy the weapons to delay a Russian advance. So what's happening is you have small, cheap, and highly lethal replacing large, expensive platforms. And this change is coming about with great rapidity. And it is massively important to take it into account in anything that you are thinking about doing. Now let me turn to a completely different aspect of the change that's going on. Excuse me for rattling around among these papers. I had it marked. Now I turn to Lucy's paper. She says, breakthrough advances in the sequencing, decoding, and manipulation of genomes of all organisms are occurring at the same time as disruptive changes in the world's ecosystem. We're in the midst of the sixth great extinction, which is predicted to culminate in the elimination of about 30% of all ocean corals. That's going on now. Sharks and rays, 30% of all freshwater mollusks, 25% of all mammals, 20% of all reptiles, and about 15% of all birds currently alive. There's a gigantic change taking place. And tropical diseases are coming north everywhere. And we are not getting up to scale on our diagnostics of them and our treatment capabilities. We also, as Lucy brings out, know how to manipulate genes in a way we never have before. So why aren't we getting some of these mosquitoes that do so much damage and fixing them so they don't do so much damage? That can be done. This is all, of course, happening as a result of the warming climate. As Lucy says, climate change is a cause of the global redistribution of infectious diseases. So that is happening. So she gives an example here. She refers to the worst animal disease pandemic in U.S. history. That was back in 1914-15 when 50 million domestic poultry in 21 states were slaughtered. How did this happen? Global warming has shifted migratory bird flights paths, leading to an overlap of the South to North Asia Pacific Flyway and North American Pacific Flyway to the Bering Strait. The Arctic waters are warming faster than other regions on Earth, so that the Bering Strait has become a meeting and mingling spot for flocks of following flyways that formerly rarely mixed DNA sequencing, enable identification of specific Asian avian flu strains that were hitching a ride in these mingling flocks, as well as their sites of origin and their mutation rates. So out of all this, we get big trouble. Well, so my point, and I won't keep belaboring these points, but I think it's quite apparent that what we are seeing as a result of technological change and increased knowledge in the biological area is a new world, a very different world. It's going to be deglobalized, and at the same time, there are weapons available that will change the battlefield landscape. We are on top of these things, so are the Chinese. I think the Russians are probably a little less able, but nevertheless can get these equipment. But going back to the nuclear problem that Henry mentioned, somehow we have to get our arms around the nuclear proliferation. And the way to do it is to put a stop sign in front of Russia and have them come to their senses, and then start working with them on the nuclear matters as well as other things. And from that, we can try to create a kind of joint enterprise to work on this issue because it threatens mankind. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Secretary Shultz. Secretary Armitage, nice to have you back.
Thank you, sir. Acting Chairman Inhofe, Ranking Member Reed, ladies and gentlemen, now I get it. I know what my job is here today. I'm a little like that fellow who followed Noah to the podium to talk about my experiences in a recent rain shower. And I do realize that your patience is in inverse proportion to the length of my opening statement. I've been here before. So if you'll allow me to make only 3 points. The first, to join my distinguished colleagues to send all best wishes and prayers to John McCain. I miss him, and I miss his voice, and I think it's important that he knows that. Second, much to my amazement, the national security strategy and the national defense strategy actually comport with each other to a very high degree. And this is no small chore, no small feat. Having participated in many of those historically, they don't often comport. This does. But I particularly want to call to note the national defense strategy because I think it's a very clear-eyed, well-written, succinct document that accomplishes things. First of all, it accomplishes a direction for the political appointees in the Pentagon. They know what the President and the Secretary of Defense want. They get it. Second, it's a clear guidepost to our uniformed military and our bureaucrats, and I mean that term in a positive sense, who populate our Pentagon and beyond. They know what the President's priorities are. And it also is very clear to you as authorizers what the President's priorities are. Set curbs, if you will, barriers along the street to show you what's important and what's not as far as the President and the Pentagon are concerned. But finally, equally important is what that document does not say. It does not say that we face an existential threat today. It talks about peer competitors. I'm all for competition. And if we do our job as a military and diplomats, peer competitors won't become adversaries and then enemies. To be an existential threat, it seems to me you have to have the capability to annihilate the United States and the desire. China has the capability and doesn't have the desire. She has too much skin in the game. Russia has the capability, does not have the desire. She prefers to use other methods to undermine the United States and Eastern Europe, and Ukraine, etc. North Korea, Iran, they don't yet have the capability, and their desire, their intention, at least to me, is still unknown. How? ISIS or terrorist groups, they've got the intention to destroy us, but they don't have the capability. So we've got to keep our eye on the ball, and the ball is to keep our peer competitors from becoming enemies and adversaries. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Well, we have a full house here, and so I'm going to be very brief, but one of the things that came across very clear from all of you, comparing our problems today with the problems of the past, we have threats that we haven't had before. All of you have served with Director Clapper, the former Director of National Intelligence. the quote that he has given us, and I'm sure you're aware of that, looking back over by now more than a half century of in intelligence, I've not experienced a time when we've been beset by more crises and threats around the globe. And then we have our chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff who even suggests that we're losing our qualitative and quantitative advantage. So it is very frightening. So I'd just like to ask each one of you, and Secretary Armitage, you were very specific on the plan that the National Defense Strategy that came out from the President, and specifically the 2-3 strategy. Would anyone like to elaborate any more on their support or non-support of that strategy that just came out?
Like Rich, I'm very impressed with what they laid out, but I think it doesn't adequately address the fact of the huge change that's taking place in deglobalization and the new kind of weaponry that's coming about and what the implications of that are. Mm-hmm. Those things need to get factored in. I'm sure they will. Jim Mattis, we had the privilege of having Jim out at Stanford's Hoover Institution for about 3 years. His office was around the corner from mine, so whenever I see his light on, I go sit down and start talking. And he is one wonderful man. He is smart. He's into everything. He knows what's going on. And if you ask him his opinion, he tells you what it is right between the eyes. There's no ambiguity about it.
I think you both do that.
He's a jewel, and I'm sure he's into all this.
Any other comments on the 2-3? Yes, Secretary Armitage.
Yes, sir. 2 comments. First of all, on the qualitative and quantitative edge that we are losing. Well, is it no wonder? We're marching and counter-marching all up and down Europe, Afghanistan, Iraq for a long time. We've really run these folks ragged, in my view. Africa now. So it's no question that we're losing our training edge, our qualitative edge. The equipment is being run into the ground. So I think the military leadership of the United States, the Secretary of Defense, and you all ought to think through this problem and make sure that we're deploying people that we really need to deploy, and we're keeping people at home that we need to keep at home. Second, I want to dispute to a tiny degree the fact that this is the messiest and most disorderly world we've ever seen. I think with 40 million refugees after World War II and 40 million dead, someone might say, no, it was pretty bad. Here's a man who participated in the Pacific in that conflict, and he can tell you personally. So it's messy and it's disorderly, but is it the worst it's ever been? I'm not sure. Maybe it seems the worst because there are questions in the international community about whether the United States is going to take a traditional lead as we have for the past 70 years. Thank you.
Yeah, and while you have the floor, there's one brief answer to this on the nuclear strategy. We've had a hearing recently, and it's been obvious to everyone that, and you all three remember this, that China and Russia have been modernizing their nuclear arsenals while we've been sitting around not doing anything and on ours. And now we are, if you look at our triad, our nuclear triad, it's all 3 legs are aging. Do you have any comments to make on your recommendation as to what we should be doing right now? Any one of you?
I am a great believer in the tremendous importance of getting rid of nuclear weapons. But I think the way to do that is, as long as there are nuclear weapons, the United States must have a robust, secure, and safe arsenal to use for deterrence and for a basis from which to negotiate down.
And we really haven't been doing any modernization since you guys are at the helm. So that's the only point I wanted to make. Do you agree with that?
I read what I guess was an early version somehow. It was sent to me of the National Security Strategy. And I liked the beginning of it because it talked about our commitment to getting rid of nuclear weapons. But as you read on, it almost sounded a little bit as though there might be this or that occasion where we would use nuclear weapons. And this notion of using them that is spreading around is deeply disturbing to me because of the consequences. I remember You remember the Chernobyl nuclear power plant accident? It was vast damage. I remember the first meeting I had with Gorbachev after that. I found that he had asked the same question I had. What's the distinction between what happened at Chernobyl and what would have happened if a nuclear weapon had been dropped there? Answer, nuclear weapon much more devastating. So you could get into your gut the sense of the utter destructiveness of these things.
Yes. Secretary Reid. Senator Reid. Lots of secretaries here.
I'm not being promoted. Thank you all, gentlemen, for the extraordinary testimony and, again, for your service to the nation. And all have reflected the importance of diplomacy and also the multifaceted challenges we face. They're not simply in the military dimension. They're environmental issues. There are demographic issues, and as Secretary Shultz has made that very clear. Can you comment, and you might begin, Secretary Shultz, and then I'll ask Secretary Kissinger and Secretary Armitage, our whole of government approach to these problems, is it adequate at the moment?
Well, it's been over a quarter of a century since I've been here. I come occasionally to testify or something. But what's going on, I know, having run 4 departments, that if you're not there, you really don't have a good idea what's going on. But I think that the challenge is really tremendous to coordinate efforts, and they need to certainly be coordinated. And my impression is, it's an impression, that since the Defense Department people can actually go and do something, there's a tendency to rely on them probably more than we should, and we should buck up other people to do more of their share. But that's just an impression.
Thank you. Dr. Kissinger, do you have any comments about the whole of government approach in terms of how well we're doing?
The challenge we face at this moment is that is to determine what our national objectives are and how to reach them in a strategic manner. The Defense Department statement about our objectives seems to me very adequate and expresses the necessities. But I would like to point out, as a student of history, that if one relies entirely on abstract military planning without having thought through the political consequences, one may find oneself in an irreversible position. None of the leaders who started World War I would have done so if they had known what the end result would be like. So when weapons are being procured, which in principle I favor strongly, one should also relate them to a military strategy that one is prepared to implement, and a diplomacy that looks for the creation of a system of world order by which you can determine the nature of the challenges and the extent to which they can be opposed. On the diplomatic side, I think we need a more systematic approach to what we are attempting to do. On the military side, I support what the Defense Department is trying to do, and I agree with the objectives that have been stated with respect to North Korea and with the Middle East, but they have been, up to now, conducted in a fragmentary rather than a coherent manner.
Thank you, Dr. Kissinger. Secretary Armitage, please.
Just briefly, sir, the whole of government sounds great, but in order to have a whole of government approach, you have to have buy-in by all the leadership, and you have to have an inventory of what your arrows are to put in your quiver. I don't think we've got that. Second, you have to have resources, and it doesn't seem to me you can have a whole of government approach if you resource the State Department in an insufficient way. If it wasn't for the Congress, we'd be down 30% in the State Department instead of the 10% that the State Department is down now. And finally, the whole of government approach has to embrace friends and allies. For us to do everything alone is wrong, in my view. And so it has to be seen that a whole of government is also diplomacy, is also getting coalitions together of allies, like-minded people, et cetera.
Thank you very much. Just a
very
final
important point that Rich made. It's not only us, but our allies that we have to work with.
Thank you all very much. And just a point, I may, you've all signaled the proliferation issue is absolutely critical. And Korea, if it continues on its projection, raises huge proliferation problems, that may be a way in which we can get the Chinese and the Russians and us to work together, because my sense is they too fear a proliferation problem. But I will leave that to the next round, if there is a next round. Thank you.
Senator Wicker.
Thank you, gentlemen. This has really been wonderful, very, very valuable to members like me. Dr. Kissinger, let me ask about NATO and a statement that you made, and after you follow up, I'll ask our other two witnesses to comment. You say NATO needs to be clear about its strategic purposes. What outcomes other than violations of territorial integrity does NATO seek to prevent? What do you suggest should be the answer to that question among NATO members?
The challenge that NATO faces now seems to me to be this. For 300 years, Europe was the designer of the international system and provided the leadership in the structure of the world, the United States, in those periods standing apart. At the end of World War II, Europe was devastated, and the United States undertook the leadership of bringing together these various nations and guaranteeing their territorial integrity. The challenge was primarily conceived to be from the Soviet Union as a military attack on Europe. Europe, under the Marshall Plan, recovered economically. Its capacity to act as a civil society, but it has not regained its leadership in international politics, and therefore at the same time, the challenges have altered from the attack from the Soviet Union to a series of crises around the world that have potential dangers, but not immediately overwhelming dangers. So it requires a higher degree of assessment. So I think it is, and so NATO has constantly been faced with a series of what are called out-of-the-area problems, which are central in many ways to the overall equation, but not central to how they conceive it domestically. So it is important, and I support strongly the administration in that effort that Europe play a more active role in some of the issues that I outlined and that my colleagues.
Is Ukraine one of those out of the area or in the area problems?
Ukraine,
and what's the definition of success there, sir?
That's exactly the issue. For Russia, historically, Ukraine has been part of their territory at least for 400 years. On the other hand, it is tied in many respects to Europe. So I personally, which is a minority view, I have thought it was unwise to try to include Ukraine in NATO, but it's also impossible to let it exist as a satellite of of Russia. So the way I express that issue is this: if the security border of Europe is the eastern border of Ukraine, then it is within 300 miles of Moscow and will create tensions with Russia. If it is on the western border of the Ukraine, it is at the border of Poland, Hungary, Romania, Baltic states. That's unacceptable for Europe and it's unacceptable for us. So therefore, is it possible to have a Ukraine solution in which Ukraine is free in the political and economic field to relate itself to its preferences, something like Finland, without the NATO participation? In any event, Russia has to adhere to the Minsk agreement because it cannot claim Ukrainian territory by force. But Ukraine is sort of at the borderline of this conception. It should be politically and economically where it wants to be. The question is, can one think of a military arrangement there that is not directly confrontational?
The chair has told me that I can ask one of you to follow up. So, Mr. Armitage, would you care to follow up on that?
From my point of view, Senator, the most important thing that we can do for NATO, first of all, is make sure they have a full understanding of the ironclad nature of our Article 5, the affection that we have for Article 5, and we have to be credible in that. And in return, it seems to me NATO's got to do something. It's not just 2% of GDP. I'm read recently that the British have no warships right now that are outside of their ports. They're in port. I think I'm correct to say the German submarine fleet is either inoperable or nearly so. This is not acceptable. So in exchange for an Article 5 commitment by the United States, I think we've got to get a commitment that they'll stand up their capabilities.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all very much for being here and for your years of service to the country. Dr. Shultz, I couldn't agree more with the discussion about the impact of technology and artificial intelligence and what's happening with and how that will affect warfare. The concern that I've got is as we look at what the potential for change in that area, how do we engage with the defense industrial base, which has been, I think, sometimes reluctant to acknowledge the need to move, and when we've got weapon systems that are very expensive and we've started down the road to development, how do we make that switch in a way that allows us to keep up with this evolving technology?
Well, I suppose we have to start taking action and creating our banks of 3D printers and start using them. And the obvious fact that small, cheap, and many is better than a few very expensive and vulnerable, is just that logic has to pervade, and we have to change.
And one of the things that I share the concern about nuclear proliferation and where we are now, and what appears to be moving closer to a nuclear war in some way, not just in how we respond to what's happening in North Korea, but as we look at modernization of our nuclear weapons, the move to smaller nukes, and this whole Russian idea that's been put forward that we can escalate to de-escalate by the use of small nuclear weapons. How should we think about responding to that? Because that does seem to be gaining some credibility in military circles.
Well, a nuclear weapon is a nuclear weapon. You use a small one, then you go to a bigger one. I think nuclear weapons are nuclear weapons, and we need to draw the line there. And one of the alarming things to me is this notion that we can have something called a small nuclear weapon, which I understand the Russians are doing, and that somehow that's usable. Your mind goes to the idea that, yes, nuclear weapons become usable, and then we're really in trouble, because a big nuclear exchange can wipe out the world. I have a great friend in San Francisco named Bill Swing. He's the retired Episcopal Bishop of California, and he started something really terrific called the United Religion Initiative. And he made a statement about a year ago. I tried to get him to publish it, but he wouldn't do it. But he said, when you put your hand on the Bible and swear to be President of the United States, that's the least of it. When you put your hand on the nuclear button and you can start something that might kill 1 million people, you're not president anymore, you're God. And who are we to say we're God? These weapons are immoral, as President Reagan said many times. And we need to get rid of them. Personally, I think the way to get rid of them is, on the one hand, maintain our strength of our arsenal. But then we need to somehow get rearranged with Russia. Personally, I'm very interested in Henry's comments on the Ukraine. But Russia signed an agreement when Ukraine got rid of its nuclear weapons that it would respect Ukraine's borders. They signed that. They totally ignored it. They don't even refer to it. That's not, we should accept that. And it seems to me with this new kind of weaponry, we can change the situation in Ukraine. And maybe that's the place where we could have what I call a Pershing moment. A Pershing moment for me is in the Cold War, the Soviets had intermediate range weapons that could hit Europe, Japan, and China, but not us. And their diplomatic ploy was, would we use our intercontinental missiles to defend our allies, risking using their intercontinental missile on us? So we had a deal with NATO that we would negotiate, and if we couldn't agree, we would deploy intermediate range weapons in Europe. And we knew we were negotiating just as much with Europeans as we were with the Soviets, because putting a nuclear weapon in your territory is not very comfortable. At any rate, negotiation was conducted. President Reagan did a very good job on it. And we came to the end. We deployed cruise missiles in Britain with Margaret's help, and in Italy with Andreotti's help. But then came the big deal. Ballistic missiles were called Pershings in Germany. And here's where the alliance came in. Everybody supported the Germans. It was very controversial. The Russians pulled out of negotiations. They did everything. They fanned war talk. But the Persians got deployed. That was a turning point in the Cold War. And it showed the Russians something special. There was a little side story, if I could just take a minute. Nancy Reagan was my pal. And she used to fix me up with a Hollywood starlet at White House dinner, so I got to dance with Ginger Rogers and stuff like that. But anyway, after the deployment of the Pershings, gradually things softened. And I could go to the president and say, Mr. President, 4 different capitals in Europe, a Soviet diplomat has come up to one of ours and said virtually the same thing, which we think boils down to, if Gromyko is invited to Washington, when he comes to the General Assembly in September, he'll accept. In other words, the Soviets flaked. I said, maybe you want to think this over, because Jimmy Carter canceled these when they went into Afghanistan, and they're still there. He said, I don't have to think it over. Let's get them here. So it was a huge event. I went to Nancy, and I said, Nancy, what's going to happen is Gromyko's going to come to the Oval Office. We'll have a meeting. probably a fairly long one. Then we'll all walk down the colonnade to the mansion. That's your home. And there's some stand-around time and then a working lunch. So it would be a nice touch if you were there for the stand-around time. You're the hostess. It would be warm. So she agreed. So Gromyko, as soon as he sees Nancy, she knows she's influential, so he makes a beeline for her. And before long, he says, "Does your husband want peace?" And Nancy could bristle. "Of course my husband wants peace." Then she said, "Well, then every night before he goes to sleep, whisper in his ear, peace." He was a little taller than she was, so she put her hand on his shoulders, pulled him down so he had to bend his knee. She said, "I'll whisper in your ear, peace." I said, "Nancy, we just won the Cold War." But that was a Pershing moment, and I think we need another Pershing moment to get the Soviets to see there's a stop sign here, and there's another path. After all, they're staggering. Their economy is a mess. Their demography is a mess. They have really tough troubles in the Caucasus. So a different arrangement would benefit them greatly. And then we could start once again down the road of talking about nuclear weapons. And then this time maybe be more inclusive, have a joint enterprise of some kind, really get after this subject.
Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen, for your appearance today and your service to our country, not least in your youth in the armed forces of the United States. Dr. Kissinger, I want to return to a point that you raised in your opening statement as well as your written testimony. I'll just repeat it. You pointed out a paradox, the possibility that in North Korea, as in Iran, an international effort intended to prevent a radical regime from developing a destabilizing capability will coincide diplomatically with the regime perfecting that very capacity. For the second time in a decade, an outcome that was widely considered unacceptable is now on the verge of becoming irreversible. Could you elaborate on why you think that's the case and what we could learn from the situation?
With respect to North Korea, there is the idea that there might be a negotiation based on a freeze for freeze. The concern I had with the Iranian agreement was that, in a way, it legitimized the eventual emergence of Iran as a nuclear power. It only delayed it by some years. The situation with North Korea is even more acute because Iran did not yet have a nuclear weapon. But if one negotiates a freeze of the existing situation, one has thereby legitimized a Korean military capability. And if that is established, other countries in the region confronting their own security problems are likely to come to the conclusion that it is safe to proceed with their nuclear program, and that then we would face a totally new situation where in a region in which there are considerable tensions, there is also an accumulation of nuclear weapons, and that once this line is crossed, as George Shultz pointed out, you are then in a world in which we have no experience about escalation, where it's difficult to establish the principles. And this would then start, in my opinion, a sequence of events in which some countries would resist this and other countries would insist on it. So therefore, I think the denuclearization of North Korea, which is not a direct, overwhelming threat to us, is important for the evolution of the international strategy with respect to non-proliferation. And therefore, we need to make a distinction between measures that might relieve the immediate tension but make an ultimate crisis all the more severe, and measures that need to be taken or could be taken to face the issue of the denuclearization of Korea, all the more so as the problem of Iran is just down the road, even under the existing deals. That is my basic point.
Thank you. Dr. Shultz, in your conversation about 4 disruptive forces, the first one you mentioned was demography and migration. Another eminent historian, Walter Russell Mead, who has testified in front of this panel before, published an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal a couple of days ago, stressing that even though this has been a source of controversy in the United States, on which we understandably focus as Americans, we just had a 3-day government shutdown about immigration. The issue was a very contentious one in our campaign. It also is very contentious in Europe. In the elections in Germany last year, the SPD and the CDU had their lowest performance since World War II. Alternative for Germany won seats in the Bundestag for the first time. And you've seen the rise of similar parties and politicians in Sweden and Austria and Czechia, Slovakia, Poland, Hungary, and so forth. What ought Western leaders be doing to better manage the challenges posed by demographic change and migration patterns?
I should think the first effort should be to do everything we can to see that the places that people are coming from are made more habitable so they don't leave. And we have lots of things that we could do that would accomplish that, I think. But then we have to reflect in our own case how beneficial immigration has been for this country. I went to a session in San Francisco the other night where we were celebrating our old mint there, and it was Alexander Hamilton's birthday. And we were all talking about how wonderful Alexander Hamilton was as our first Secretary of Treasury. He was an immigrant. Henry Kissinger is an immigrant. Einstein was an immigrant. So we've benefited greatly. I dare say everybody in this room is either an immigrant or descended from one. So we need to be looking carefully at our borders and having a sensible immigration policy. And people in these places, there may be people that are perfectly okay for us. But I think the first thing is to do everything possible to help them have places where they want to stay.
Thank you all, gentlemen.
Thank you, Chairman. Secretary Shultz, you mentioned the coming changes from artificial intelligence, from additive manufacturing, and another rapidly changing part of our world, as you know, is the energy field. And you've been a strong voice for American leadership, for a conservative voice for addressing climate and energy. But at the moment, we find ourselves in a position where the White House has obviously pulled back from the Paris Accord. They are implementing protectionist policies with regard to clean energy deployment in our country. So I'm curious your thoughts on what you believe America's posture with regard to climate leadership in the world and implementation of a clean energy strategy should look like.
Well, just as we have a threat throughout the world from nuclear weapons, we have a threat that's global from the warming climate. The paper by Lucy Shapiro that I read from shows on the biological side some of those threats, but there are many others. I think there are 2 things that should be done that will help a lot. Number one, a lot of people object to all these regulations. The government telling you do this, don't do that, and so forth. Say, all right, let's get rid of all that. Let's put in place a revenue-neutral carbon tax. Put a price out there and let the market decide. So in the program that I've been working on with Tom Stevenson, who's here, we would start with a $40 a ton tax and make it revenue neutral. So you'd pass the money back to, let's say, everybody who has a Social Security number. So they would make it a progressive tax, and it wouldn't have any fiscal drag, and it would sort out people, get them the incentives they need to go for things that are low in carbon. The other thing that I think is very important is to maintain a respectable government program supporting energy R&D. And it doesn't have to be huge, because I know I'm the chairman of MIT's Energy Advisory Board. They have a big program at MIT, and I have more or less the same role at Stanford. And so I listen to what these guys are doing. And the R&D is dramatic. It is now, as a result of the R&D, our solar costs are way down. I mean, see, fracking was a result of R&D, and this can be very productive. So we want to keep that going. And we have been working at it at these two universities. A while ago, we had an exchange. We brought a bunch of, like 12 MIT scientists to Stanford, and we had about the same number. We had 2 days of talk about what we call game changers. And we went to MIT, and we did the same thing. Then we came to Washington, and John Boehner, who was then Speaker, set us up with the Republicans on the House Energy Committee. These are supposed to be the bad guys. Well, it turned out that selling them energy R&D was a piece of cake. Somebody said, well, then here's a great idea. Let's have the government go into business and exploit it. You lost everybody, including me. So let's have the government stay out of the business but support the energy R&D. And I think that has broad support. And there are things that are on the cusp right now that are very important. Of course, the Holy Grail is to get to a large-scale storage of electricity. If you can do that, not only do you have an impact on solar and wind and the intermittency problem, but you also have some security because our grid is so vulnerable to attack. If we have some storage to rely on, that would be good. But anyway, the R&D is very important, and you pair R&D with a revenue-neutral carbon tax, and I think you have the kind of program that'll work.
Thank you for your thoughts on that. My next question is for any of you to address. I'm just really concerned about some of the statistics we're seeing out of the State Department right now in terms of being able to attract talent and losing folks from that pool at rates we just haven't seen before. Are just attracting people for entry-level positions is we're at about a quarter of what we were a couple of years ago. There are problems with the seasoned pool as well. What should we be doing to address that?
I'll give it a go, Senator. The A100 classes, the entry classes that we have at the State Department, and yes, they're down. People read the papers, they hear the news, they think they're not particularly welcome. But the real impact of this, of what's going on now, will really be felt in about 15 years. As Deputy Secretary, I had to chair the D Committee. The D Committee makes the decisions on who we're going to put forward as ambassadors to different posts. And I was having trouble toward the end of my tenure as Deputy Secretary because of a previous slowdown in the accession to the State Department, the A100 class. We just didn't have sufficient number of head and shoulders diplomats that I felt comfortable putting into leadership positions. So we've got to turn around the attitude, and I think that attitude needs to start with our president and stop talking about deep state and taking ownership of everything. Anyone who served in the military, Senator Reid will tell you this, we learned everything we ever needed to know in the first general order, which cautions young sentries to take charge of all this post and all government property in sight and stand this post till properly relieved. That's all you need to know. And that's the position I think our president has to take and our Secretary of State have to take.
I'd like to say a word not only on behalf of the Foreign Service, but the career people generally. In 1969, I became Secretary of Labor, and I was told that it was an impossible job for a Republican because the Labor Department staff was a wholly owned subsidiary of the AFL-CIO. We brought in a really top-notch bunch of people, and the bureaucracy knocked themselves out for us. We made friends with George Meany, but still, they're there to serve. I found the same thing when I was director of OMB, same thing in the Treasury, same thing in the State Department. The Foreign Service people are able, they're trained, they're experienced, they've been worked with, particularly by the director of the Foreign Service, to move them around to get the right kind of experience, and they are invaluable. And I agree particularly with Rich's point, the future is the new people. And it takes time to bring them in, to train them, to give them experiences. You can't learn from just reading something. You've got to have experience, move around and learn things from that. So it's essential.
I'd like to make a point here. I agree what George Shultz has said about the quality of the Foreign Service, and also what my other colleague has said about the impact of current decisions 10 years down the road. But I do think the State Department needs a combination of reorganization and rethinking in one respect. The military are used to dealing with strategy because they have to have an ultimate objective. And so the Pentagon is organized to make decisions in a conceptual framework. The State Department is more organized to have conversations. The various officials, the Foreign Service officers, in their experience abroad, much of the time have to deal with immediate current problems. And so they have a tendency to look for the immediate solution and not so much for the strategic outcome. Of course, there are great exceptions in this. So I would think a reorganization of the State Department that leads more systematically to strategic thinking and less preoccupation with a very immediate problem would be highly desirable. And it's no reflection on the people that are in there now. That has to do with the nature of foreign policy as it has evolved.
Wouldn't that mean, Henry, to do everything you can to improve the stature of the policy planning staff? That is, they're supposed to be people thinking strategically with the Secretary. And over the years, there have been some outstanding times of that, some not so good, but that's a key ingredient.
Well, I try to solve the problem to some extent by making sure that every action decision also went through the policy planning staff so that the department understood this. But I think also in the training of the Foreign Service officers and in the issues which they are asked to address, there is some more systematic opportunity to deal with grand strategy in addition to what they already do well, which is the day-to-day management of things.
I'm afraid, Mr. Chair, we could use some lessons in short-term versus long-term strategy as well.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, thank you all for your very distinguished service to our country. I'm just curious, and I'd like to begin with Secretary Shultz, and then if either of you other gentlemen have a thought on it, I would appreciate it. With regard to nuclear deterrence and the approach that we have taken, specifically with regard to Russia, there appears to be a thought within the Russian military that there is an interest in being able to escalate in order to de-escalate, and the use of low-yield nuclear weapons in some cases, particularly in their region. And my question is, in your analysis, which is the greater deterrent force that should be brought to bear? Should we have the overwhelming force of a high-yield capability only, or should we have both the high-yield capability as well as the ability to respond in like kind? And would the Russians take the threat of an immediate retaliation to be greater if we had both options available to us?
As I said earlier, it seems to me the idea of a low-yield nuclear weapon is kind of a mirage. It's a nuclear weapon. it has all kinds of aspects to it. Even a low-yield weapon would have huge damage immediately, and it's had radiation and so on, and invites escalation. So my own opinion is I hate to see people start figuring out how they can use nuclear weapons. That's what it amounts to, because their use is so potentially devastating. You get an escalation going and a nuclear exchange going, and it can be ruinous to the world very easily.
Would you disagree with an analysis that concludes that Russia would actually use a low-yield nuclear weapon as a response to a conventional conflict?
Well, what the Russians will do, I don't know. I read that they are developing what they call a low-yield weapon. I think it's a mirage. But if they wind up using one, it's going to lead to an escalation. And maybe the best deterrent is for them to know that. But I think the better way to go about it with Russia is to put a stop sign to the kind of thing they've been doing and say, now let's get back to where we can talk together in a sensible way. And we were able to do that before. And we had very fruitful exchanges with the Soviets, not just with Gorbachev, but across the board. And we got a lot accomplished as a result. And I think if we were able to get back to that kind of thing, then this time we could reach out to others and try to really move the ball ahead on getting rid of these weapons.
Thank you. Mr. Armitage?
Just a historical tidbit, sir. We actually had man-portable nuclear weapons at one time in our inventory. But we came to the conclusion that a nuclear weapon is a nuclear weapon. We also had a great deal of success, Secretary Shultz particularly, in the INF discussions in 1983 with the Germans when we wanted INF weapons, to blunt, tactical nukes, to blunt a Soviet thrust through the Fulda Gap. So this has been up and down the flagpole several different times. And I think that the Russians and the Americans come to the same conclusion that you uttered, sir. Nuclear weapon is a nuclear weapon, and you can't control it.
Thank you. I'm just curious, today we've talked about a number of different locations that are hotspots today. We've talked about Europe, we've talked about the South Pacific with China, Middle East, and yet during this entire discussion, there has been no discussion about the continent of Africa or the continent of South America. I'm just curious if, in regard to our diplomatic efforts and so forth, and the opportunities that are there, I think about it because I know that Senator Inhofe has been one of those individuals who's been very active in Africa, having made 156 different country visits to Africa that I'm aware of. And the emphasis that is there, it seems to me that we are wide open for the opportunity for not only goodwill, but for the creation of cooperative partnerships there in both South America and in Africa. And I'd just like your thoughts in terms of the importance of those two continents and why it is that we, in the middle of a strategic discussion, we haven't mentioned either one of them so far.
I think your point is right on.
You may want to put your microphone on.
I think your point is right on, as I said earlier. I think in the African countries, that's where the explosion of population is likely to come from. And I think for various reasons, that's where the migration is likely to come from. And if we have constructive relationships there, maybe we can help create conditions where people are less anxious to leave. And that's, I think, probably the best way of dealing with the migration issue. So I agree with you. As far as South America and Central America and Mexico are concerned, I remember when I took office, President Reagan said, foreign policy starts in our neighborhood. If you buy a house, you look at the house, but you also say, what's the neighborhood? And if it's a good neighborhood, you'll buy the house. If it isn't, you won't. So we work very hard to bring Mexico into North America. And finally, with NAFTA, Mexico became part of North America. And that worked wonderfully, not only in economic terms, but it gave you the basis for talking about many, many other things. Terrorism problems, environmental problems, all kinds of little issues that come along. You develop a friendly, easy, candid relationship. The Three Amigos comes along. So all of this is very positive about our neighborhood, and it's been a very hard thing for me to see us denouncing Mexico and trying to break it up, because this is our neighborhood. This is where we live. And we're working well. And we worry about, we say, oh, their drug gangs are coming over here. Where do the drug gangs come from? They come from the war on drugs in the United States. That's where the money comes from. That's where the guns come from. That's where the incentive comes from. So I think we ought to look at the war on drugs ourselves, what we're doing. And at the same time, obviously, our neighborhood deserves attention, and not just Mexico, but Central America and on south. There's some good things happening, some bad things happening down south, but this is where we live.
Thank you. My time is
Could I make a point on the nuclear weapons issue? I've been part of this discussion since 1950s. And my original reaction to the problems of massive retaliation was to see whether tactical nuclear weapons might provide a substitute or an alternative. And at that time, I came to the conclusion that has been presented here, that the distinction could not be drawn in any manner that was workable at the time. Now we are moving into an area in which apparently relatively smaller tactical weapons are being considered by opponents. It's not a course I would recommend as our preferred solution. But the issue will arise if this happens, if this becomes the technology, and if our only response then is an all-out nuclear war, that we will face again the same dilemmas we had with the massive retaliation concept. And so, while I would like to maintain a dividing line between nuclear and non-nuclear weapons, and while it would be highly desirable if some agreements could be made that would enforce this, if the technology develops in such a way that other major countries possess them, we should think carefully before we put ourselves into a position where our only response is an all-out nuclear strike.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Kissinger, it's an honor to have you here, and thank you for your service in providing the wisdom today. Mr. Armitage talked about China having the means but not the desire to attack us. My question is to you, based upon your long years of study of China, the book you wrote on China, what does China want?
Of course, this develops out of a long culture. This is my assessment based on my observations. We in the Western tradition think that for a country to be dominant, it has to conquer regions and occupy them. I think the Chinese historical view is that the Chinese, while they will use force, are thinking that their impact is through the magnitude of their culture, the size of their achievements, and that they will attempt to impose respect rather than do it through a series of military confrontations. But it will always be backed by a force with which they can demonstrate the penalty of opposition. So if you look at their conflicts in the communist period with India, with Vietnam, and to some extent with us, they have always been aimed at for some dramatic demonstration followed by some negotiation that then benefits from the performance. So I think the Chinese at this moment are proceeding by their cultural pattern. The Belt and Road concept is an attempt to restructure Eurasia, but not entirely or largely by military conquest, but through a performance that will lead these countries to look at China as the central kingdom. For us, the problem is hegemony by any one country over Eurasia is a potential threat to our security. So the issue, in my mind, is it possible to have such a competition by political means with the backing of the military force that may be needed? But for that, we first have to know what we consider threats to our security, how we convey that to China. In China, in my opinion now, there are probably two schools of thought. One that believes that a general conflict would risk everything that they have achieved and would even in the long run be very difficult to manage. And another one that thinks that America is basically on the decline and that therefore no attention needs to be paid to our strategic concerns and that they can simply plow ahead, not in a military way primarily, but in a way that challenges the system. That seems to me to be the key issue in our relations with China. And I think it is of great importance that we attempt a conversation, a permanent relationship in which we decide we will not settle our conflicts by military means, that we will take account of the other's point of view, but where we also make clear that if essential interests are touched, in the end, a conflict will happen. So this is a partly philosophical problem, and it depends how we conduct our dialogue in this period when both countries are evolving in a new direction. China, after several hundred years, re-entering the international system, but America dealing not only with what we've discussed here, but I have been very much concerned with the impact of, say, of artificial intelligence and the whole evolution of science, in which the scientists are running way ahead of what the political world has been able to absorb. And so how to master those trends seems to me the key issue in the China relationship. And I cannot conceive of a war between China and the United States that will not do to the world what World War I did to Europe. And so that should be in the minds of both leaders. But it may not be. And if it isn't, then we will have to look to our interests. And we must always have the capability to prevail in such a conflict.
I now understand why generations of United States presidents have sought your counsel. That was brilliant, and I appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Kuhn. Senator Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the panel for being here this morning. Dr. Shultz, to your left. I'm down here on the kids' side. Thank you for your service to our country. I was very interested in your comments about threats that we haven't seen before. I think specifically about your comments, new threats would be small, smart, cheap, and very lethal. I combined together your comments about drones with new technology and the new gene editing advancements carrying unique and specific biological weapons. How do we create a national defense strategy around these new emerging threats the world has never seen before?
One more question.
I think it's a very hard question.
Yes.
And in our own little work at Stanford's Hoover Institution, we're trying to address it. We're trying to say to ourselves, what is going to be the impact of this on us? What's going to be the impact on Russia, on China, on Iran, and so on, in South America, around the world? And after we try to think our way through those things, and say, well, then how do we position ourselves in this new kind of world to be effective? To be effective in advancing our interests and taking care of our own population. But the threat of pandemics coming from climate change, as Lucy Shapiro brings out in her paper, read that paper. I read that paper and I called her up and I said, Lucy, I just read your paper, I'm shivering. It's very compelling stuff. But there are also things that you can do with this new technology that she talks about that will help us. And so I think we ought to be pursuing these things very aggressively.
Thank you, sir. I certainly would allude to the chairman, Dr. Shultz's comments about perhaps having Lucy Shapiro come talk to us about the importance of the new gene editing opportunities, whether it's CRISPR or Cas9 and other new avenues that we'll have to explore in the future. Dr. Kissinger, I'd love to ask you a question.
I want to underline, Mr. Chairman, that you ought to get Lucy to come here and talk. She's so smart, but she's so much fun. And she just will light up the place, but you're also going to learn a lot from her.
Well, you guys have been very engaging and also very intelligent, so thank you for being here. Dr. Kissinger, this morning I had the privilege of having breakfast with one of your high school mates, Chairman Alan Greenspan, who said hello. My question for you, sir, is would you talk a little bit about the utility of economic sanctions against Russia, specifically energy sanctions, as a way of impacting their aggressive behavior?
Russia is, in my view, not a strong country. Russia is a weak country with a large military establishment and a very determined leadership. So, Russia has presented historically a dual challenge to itself and to the world. It covers 11 time zones. It is involved in every region of the world. It has no natural borders. So it has always been attempted to expand, to extend its security belt. On the other hand, at crucial moments in human history, it stood up to the Mongols, to the Swedes, to the French, and to the Germans, and preserved the equilibrium of the world by the willingness of its people to suffer for their independence. So when I talk about Russia, I try to recognize both of these aspects. We need a cooperative Russia for the peace of the world because of its reach. But we want to contain an aggressive Russia that seeks to impose its domination on neighboring countries. So one always faces this dual concern. Russia being weak, sanctions are, of course, a normal weapon. One cannot accept the notion that Russia has a right to alter the shape of the Ukraine by its own unilateral decisions. But one's effort should be not to break up Russia, but to retain Russia in the system in some fashion. So I would have agreed with the concept of sanctions, but I would also think now how to bring Russia back into a community of nations concept, or even a cooperative relationship with the United States. I met Putin 15 years ago, and at that time the issue was the abrogation of the missile defense agreement in which I had been involved. And at that time, this was a month before 9/11, Putin said, I'm not so interested in the missile defense agreement. I'm interested in radical Islam. And I want to know whether it is possible to have a strategic partnership with America going from Tehran to Macedonia. So that sort of thing is in the back of their mind, but there is also in the front of their mind the environment. So my answer to your question would be, I would reluctantly have agreed to sanctions. I would now look for a way to see whether we can restore a meaningful dialogue in the context that I mentioned, even keeping in mind some of the absolutely unacceptable things they did during our election campaign, which have to be precluded in any further. But I would now think in the restructuring of the world that I try to indicate, we should make an effort to have a dialogue with Russia.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Warren.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses for being here today and for your history of service. Secretary Shultz, Secretary Kissinger, you along with former Secretary of Defense Bill Perry and former Senate Armed Services Committee Chairman Sam Nunn have formed a group of former senior national security officials who've warned about the risk of nuclear proliferation. Together, you've called for a global effort to reduce reliance on nuclear weapons. In 2007, the four of you wrote, We endorse setting the goal of a world free of nuclear weapons and working energetically on the actions required to achieve that goal. Now, today in this hearing, we have talked about Russia and Russia's nuclear policy, but I want to ask about America's nuclear policy. In the coming weeks, the Trump administration will release its nuclear policy review, which is rumored to call for new nuclear weapons capability, more usable nukes, and expanded conditions under which the United States would contemplate using a nuclear weapon. Secretary Shultz, do you continue to believe that the United States should reduce its reliance on nuclear weapons? And if so, why do you believe that would be in our national security interests?
I think the use of nuclear weapons.
Is your mic on?
I think it's on. I think the use of nuclear weapons would promote an exchange and would be devastating to our planet. So I continue to believe that we should be trying to eliminate them. We were getting there for a while, and now that's all stopped, and now our problem is proliferation. So this is a new problem. We have to work at it, and work at it hard.
Thank you. And specifically, you've recommended that we change the posture of our deployed weapons to increase warning time, and that we eliminate the class of short-range nuclear weapons that are designed to be forward deployed. How would taking steps like that reduce the risk of miscalculation that could lead to a nuclear exchange?
Well, actually, the intermediate range nuclear weapons we did deploy in the Reagan period, and particularly the ones we deployed in Germany, the Pershings, I think was the turning point in the Cold War. But we agreed with the then Soviets to eliminate them. So that whole class of weapons was eliminated. I read now that the Russians are in the process of violating that agreement. I'm no knowledge, just what I read in the papers about it. And I think that's an ominous development. But I agree very much with what Henry was saying earlier, that we need to somehow put a stop sign to the aggressive behavior of Russia and try to include them in a constructive dialogue, which then we could expand to other countries and try to get a joint enterprise going that would have the objective of getting nuclear weapons out of the world.
Thank you. That's very helpful. I appreciate your answer. There's one other topic I would like to ask you about. Last year, the Trump administration sought a significant cut to the funding for the Department of State, and many of us are concerned about reports of turmoil at the State Department, low morale, ambassadorships that have been left unfilled, senior career diplomats who are resigning in large numbers. And I know that Senator Reid asked about morale at the State Department, but I want to ask the question from a different point of view. The world still looks to the United States for leadership, and I'm concerned that we are increasingly not there to answer the call. So let me ask Secretary Kissinger and Secretary Shultz, what impact does the Trump administration's apparent downsizing of the State Department have on our national security and on advancing our interests around the world? Would you like to start, Dr. Kissinger?
I don't look at the State Department primarily in terms of its size. I would look at it in terms of its missions. And, of course, its missions should be to supply us with a correct analysis of where we are functioning, of developing a group of people that can think strategically side by side with the Pentagon. So this must have a minimum size. And I would not make downsizing in the abstract a principal objective. When one looks at the organization chart of the State Department, there are a lot of special assistants and sort of technical assignments that can probably be dispensed with. I have not thought that the size of the State Department is the principal obstacle to foreign policy.
Dr. Shultz? I'm sorry.
So I think we should staff it to the level that we think is needed for our general foreign policy. I think this year it's too dramatic.
Thank you. Secretary Shultz?
Well, you told me, Rich, earlier when we discussed this, that the cuts that were proposed have not been gone through and that the Congress has limited them greatly, which I welcome. But I think it is essential that we have a strong foreign service to do the kind of analytical work that Henry was talking about and have the capacity in the field to execute. Execution is key. A strong analytical group. I added, when I was secretary, a lot of work on the security side. And in an odd way, as an economist, I had a little Council of Economic Advisors added, because it seemed to me I was getting from people who knew a lot about subjects something that didn't have economic analysis in it. So we had a little CEA in the State Department. But that's just small organizational rearrangements. But I think we need a strong State Department. And as Rich was saying earlier, it's particularly important to have a strong inflow of talent, because these are the people 10, 15 years from now that you'll be looking to. You've got to bring them in, train them, give them experiences. They're not going to learn from books. They've got to have experience out in the field, and that's what they get. So that's essential to keep going.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Warren.
Thank you.
Senator Sullivan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and gentlemen, thank you for your decades of service and being here. I apologize. The only thing that was going to keep me away from this hearing was my presiding duties over the Senate, so I just had to go preside for the last hour, but I'm glad I made it back in time to ask a few questions, so it's great to see all of you again. For really the whole panel, maybe our two former Secretaries of State, you know, there's been a lot of focus, Dr. Kissinger, as you mentioned in your testimony, on the immediate challenge in North Korea. The Trump administration has pretty much put out a red line. I think they've called it that. Maybe they haven't called it that, but that they're not going to allow North Korea to have the capability of an intercontinental ballistic missile with a nuclear weapon on top. And yet, that red line has either already been crossed in terms of some intel analysts, or is going to be crossed soon. And so it's led to a discussion among many policy officials and military experts on what is really, in some people's view, a coming fork in the road, that if that's the policy of the administration, that they're not going to allow that. And yet North Korea either has it or is going to have it very soon. The fork in the road is either some kind of preemptive military option to prevent that capability with all its inherent risks, or an increasingly tight sanctions regime, perhaps with a naval blockade that would address clamping down on North Korea even more with China's help, hopefully, and addressing the issue that you mentioned, Dr. Kissinger, of proliferation. Could you just, in your expertise for all the witnesses today, give us your sense on that fork in the road? Is that a false choice? Is that something, how would you be thinking about that issue, particularly given that this administration has said, we are not going to allow this, and yet it looks like it's going to happen soon?
In terms of the analysis I gave here, we will hit that fork in the road. the temptation to deal with it with a preemptive attack is strong, and the argument is rational. But I have seen no public statement by any leading official, but in any event, my own thinking, I would be very concerned by a unilateral American war at the borders of China and Russia, in which we are not supported by a significant part of the world, or at least of the Asian world. And if China took an unqualified opposition to the nuclear program and a joint program with us, I think it should be possible to develop the sort of sanctions and pressures that are irresistible. And that would be my preferred course. And on the other hand, if it turns out that neither is available, then we better get used to the fact that South Korea, in my opinion, will not accept being the only Korea that has no nuclear weapons. That will lead to similar trends in Japan, and then we are living in a new world in which technically competent countries with adequate command structures are possessing nuclear weapons in an area in which there are considerable national disagreements. That is a new world, which will require new thinking by us. And it will require also a rethinking, I believe, of our whole deterrent posture. Because right now our deterrent posture is basically assumes one major enemy. But when you deal with a world in which there will be multiple possibilities of conflicts in which we are engaged, so that we cannot hold back our strategic weapons for one decisive thing, we'll have to rethink it. I don't know yet in which way. And this is why I think this little country that by itself cannot present an overwhelming threat to us, in a way presents a key issue right now. I support the administration objective, but when we get to your question, we have to do some prayerful thinking, because that will be to fight a war at the border of China and Russia without some agreement with them alone. That is a big decision. And I'm telling you my doubts and my thinking. In a policy, I agree with bringing pressure on North Korea, and I agree with the statements the administration has made up to now. And I have not stated this publicly before, but if you ask me directly, what do I think of a war with Korea? This is what I think.
Secretary Shultz, Secretary Armitage, do you have any thoughts on that very important question?
Henry has given a very thoughtful statement. I would say, be careful with red lines.
Yes.
I remember at the start of World War II, I'm a boot in the Marine Corps. And I remember the day the sergeant handed me my rifle. He said, take good care of this rifle. This is your best friend. And remember one thing. Never point this rifle at anybody unless you're willing to pull the trigger. No empty threats. Empty threats destroy you. So I'd be very careful in drawing red lines that imply that if somebody messes with them, there's going to be a nuclear war. I agree entirely with Henry here that we should be working with China and perhaps Russia, but particularly China. And as it dawns on everybody that what is potentially happening here is exactly what Henry said, that there's going to be a proliferation of nuclear weapons all through Asia. That's not very comfortable for China. And I think if we could work constructively with China on this, we just might get somewhere.
Thank you.
And I can't help but believe, I know it's been a while, but my own experience with China, like Henry's, has been that you can work constructively with the Chinese. After all, they are losing population. They have plenty of problems. Their GDP per capita is not high, and they want to raise it, and they're not going to raise it by turning their back on the rest of the world. They're going to raise it by interacting and being part of it.
Thank you. Mr. Secretary.
Senator Sullivan, I'm in the position of a guy who says that everything that can be said has been said, just not by me. So I'm going to forego the temptation.
Mr. Chairman, may I seek the indulgence of you and the witnesses for one final question?
Yes.
Thank you. Dr. Kissinger, you mentioned with regard to China as the rise of China and the insights in your testimony when you mentioned that China in its centuries-long history has never conceived of a foreign nation as more than a tributary to the centrality of its power and culture. I was wondering, in that regard, there's an issue that a number of us have been focused on. It's the basic principle of reciprocity. And it seems that increasingly in our relationship with China, us and other countries, that there seems to be a lack of reciprocity in how they operate and how we operate, meaning that there are many things that China does here in our country that if you were an American citizen, an American diplomat, an American journalist, an American company, you could not do the same thing in China. And that goes across a broad spectrum of foreign direct investment. They come here, they buy American companies in all kinds of sectors. We couldn't do that over there. They have thousands of so-called journalists in our country. We couldn't do that over there. Could you comment just on this issue, given your decades-long experience with China and how this issue of reciprocity, which a number of us are starting to focus on as a key principle in our relationship, should be something that we could do, but it doesn't seem something that they currently seem interested in. And does that reflect your comments and your testimony about them never really perceiving a foreign nation as an equal in the long history of that country?
No, the history of a country sort of forms its character to some extent. China didn't have a foreign ministry until 1911. Before 1911, foreign policy was conducted by something called the Ministry of Rituals, which placed the foreign country in a hierarchy vis-a-vis China. So it is part of their thinking, of their experience. On the other hand, we have seen that President Xi at Davos last year presented a sort of global view, and I believe China has understood that in this world the principles of sovereignty and equality will be the governing ones. But in the natural analysis, there is, to some extent, it's in the back of the mind. In my experience, I think the Chinese are compulsive students, and they analyze each problem with enormous care. So to your question, our approach is usually pragmatic. We want a solution to a problem. The Chinese approach is usually no problem gets finally solved. Every solution is an admissions ticket to another problem. The issue between us when we talk is how do you marry the conceptual approach of the Chinese with the pragmatic approach? I think that the Chinese are very confident now of their achievement. At the same time, I believe it likely that the leadership realizes that it is very difficult, if not impossible, for them to carry out the domestic changes in an atmosphere of Cold War with the United States. And therefore, I have believed that at least an attempt should be made to see whether we could come to some understanding of the limits of our conduct towards each other, and where possible, where we can operate cooperatively. But if you look at the road and belt thing, if it progresses, it goes across many great civilizations, and not all of them are going to adhere to that automatically. So there should be an occasion for the United States to develop its concept, the Chinese theirs, with a lot of flexibility given the scope. But when there is no flexibility and a contest occurs, we have to be aware of the fact that it would have catastrophic consequences for the world, and that it is hard to see who can win with modern weapons, with new weapons that one has no experience with weapons like George has described. This is what drives my thinking on China. I recognize that by their scope and their history, they are a powerful force in the world. We can't abolish that. We have to be sure that we understand what our role is in the world and develop a long-range dialogue that doesn't change every 4 years, and capacity to deal with it. That's now, and a part of that, of course, is that any lasting structure must have reciprocity. Maybe not in every individual field, but the perception of the chief actors has to be that the relationship is reciprocal.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Sullivan. This has been just overwhelming to us to be able to hear from you, and this was actually better than it was back in 2015. So I thank you very much for your patience and for your wisdom. You've done a great service to America. Thank you so much. We are adjourned.
Thank you. Well done, gentlemen. Very well done.
Well, we've been practicing this.
Are you practicing?
You think you've done this before.
He's the good guy.
Help from you with spelling.
And as you know, the Marine Corps drill instructor I'm going to come up soon. I have two of my 3 daughters.
The nation's mayors are in Washington this week. One of the issues they are looking at is federal immigration policy.